Welcome back. You're listening to the Relational Safety Podcast. I'm Stephanie Underwood, registered social worker and trauma therapist. And yes, today's episode is going to be another lengthy one, and I highly recommend splitting it into two parts because it's a lot of content to take in. We're talking about something that has completely changed how I understand what happens in therapy rooms, and it's called predictive processing. Predictive processing is actually a framework from neuroscience that explains something most of us have observed but haven't had the language for, which is that we are not experiencing the world exactly as it is. None of us are. And understanding why that's true has enormous implications for how we understand trauma, attachment, and healing. At every moment, your brain is receiving enormous amounts of information from your senses and from inside your body. But sensory information does not arrive with its meaning attached. A facial expression does not arrive labeled angry. A racing heart does not arrive labeled danger. A delayed text message does not arrive labeled rejection. Your brain has to determine what those signals probably mean, and it does not start from scratch. It uses what it has learned before to predict what is most likely happening now. This is the basic idea behind predictive processing, an influential framework in neuroscience and cognitive science that proposes that perception involves an ongoing interaction between predictions generated by the brain and incoming sensory evidence. Rather than functioning like a camera that simply records the outside world, the brain can be understood more like an inference system. It is constantly attempting to answer a question. Based on what I already know and the evidence available right now, what is most likely going on? And that seemingly simple idea has enormous implications for how we understand perception, emotion, anxiety, trauma, attachment, and human relationships. Let me give you a simple example. Imagine walking into your kitchen late at night. The room is dark, you glance toward the counter and see a long, curved shape. For half a second, you think, snake. Then you turn on the light. It is a phone charger. What happened? Your eyes provided incomplete sensory information, and your brain had to interpret it. Based on the shape, lighting, context, previous knowledge, and whatever other information was available, one explanation briefly became plausible. There is a snake on the counter. Then, new sensory evidence arrived. The lights came on. The new information did not fit the original prediction very well, and your brain revised its interpretation. Phone charger. That tiny moment illustrates several of the fundamental ideas behind predictive processing. Prior knowledge influenced perception. The brain generated a prediction about the cause of sensory information. New evidence was compared with that prediction. The mismatch provided information for updating, and your interpretation changed. Most of the time, this happens so quickly that you never notice it. Now, the traditional intuition about perception is fairly straightforward. Something happens in the environment, your senses detect it, the information travels into the brain identifies what it is, and you respond. But perception is considerably more complicated than that. Sensory signals are noisy, incomplete, and sometimes ambiguous. Your brain, therefore, has to infer the hidden causes behind them. The light reaching your retina is not the object itself. Sound waves reaching your ears are not inherently words, danger, or reassurance. Changes in your heartbeat do not contain an explanation for why your heart is beating faster. Signals provide evidence, but meaning has to be inferred. Predictive processing proposes that the brain helps solve this problem by using an internal model of the world to generate predictions about the causes of incoming sensory information. Perception emerges from the interaction between what the brain predicts and what the senses provide. The brain is not passively receiving reality. It is actively constructing its best guess about what is happening. Now, the word prediction can be misleading. In everyday conversation, prediction usually means consciously anticipating the future. I think it is going to rain tomorrow. I think she is going to cancel. Predictive processing uses the term more technically. A prediction is a model-generated estimate of what sensory input, state, or outcome should occur given a particular explanation of what is happening. These predictions do not have to be conscious. You do not walk around deliberately calculating the expected shape of every coffee cup, the sound of every familiar voice, or the location of your feet before each step. Much of this processing occurs automatically. So when researchers describe the brain as predictive, they are not suggesting that your brain is sitting inside your skull making verbal guesses about the future. They are describing a system that uses previously learned regularities to anticipate and interpret incoming information. Let me break down the core components because the terminology can sound intimidating, but the concepts are surprisingly intuitive. First, priors. A prior is essentially what the system considers plausible before the newest evidence has been fully incorporated. Your priors are shaped by previous experience, learning, context, and repeated patterns. Suppose someone hears footsteps behind them while walking. If they are walking through a busy grocery store at noon, one interpretation is likely. If they are alone in a parking garage at 2 in the morning, another may become more probable. The sound may be similar, but the context changes the prior probability of different explanations. Previous learning matters too. Someone who has repeatedly experienced aggression in certain situations may assign greater probability to danger than someone whose history has made the same situation seem relatively harmless. The incoming cue does not change. The model interpreting it does. Second, sensory evidence. Predictions are constrained by incoming information. This includes external sensory information like vision, sound, touch, smell, temperature, and pain. It also includes interoceptive information, meaning signals related to the internal condition of the body, including cardiovascular, respiratory, visceral, and other physiological states. And here's the important part. Sensory evidence is not identical to its interpretation. A furrowed brow is visual information. This person is disappointed in me is an inference. A faster heartbeat is physiological information. Something terrible is happening is an interpretation. Those distinctions matter because the gap between evidence and interpretation is where our predictive models do their work. Third, likelihood. The brain must evaluate how compatible incoming information is with different possible explanations. Imagine receiving a one-word reply from someone. Fine. What does it mean? They could genuinely be fine. They could be irritated. They could be busy. They could be distracted. They could be ending the conversation. The sensory evidence alone does not resolve the ambiguity. Your brain evaluates possible explanations according to how well the available evidence fits each one, and your previous experience may strongly influence which explanation seems most plausible. And fourth, precision. Not all information receives equal weight. Predictive processing uses the concept of precision to describe something roughly analogous to confidence or reliability. Imagine hearing a faint noise outside your window. You are unsure whether you actually heard something, so that sensory evidence has relatively low reliability. Now imagine hearing glass shatter 3 feet away. Much stronger evidence. But confidence can also exist in prior beliefs. If a person has an extremely strong prior belief that rejection is imminent, ambiguous evidence may have difficulty changing that prediction. This becomes particularly important when thinking about persistent anxiety or trauma-related expectations. Sometimes the issue is not simply what a person predicts. It is how much confidence the system places in that prediction relative to contradictory information. Now let's talk about prediction error because it's one of the most important concepts in this framework, and it's also one of the easiest to misunderstand. A prediction error occurs when incoming evidence differs from what was predicted. You predicted one thing, you observed another, and the mismatch between them is the prediction error. Suppose your friend normally replies within 10 minutes. Today you message them and 3 hours pass. That outcome differs from the pattern you expected, which is a prediction error. Now imagine they eventually reply, "Sorry, my phone died." You have acquired new information that may explain the discrepancy without requiring you to fundamentally revise your model of the relationship. But imagine instead that delayed responses begin happening repeatedly. Your previous model may eventually need updating. Prediction error provides information that allows learning to occur. Here's a distinction that matters a lot. Prediction error is not the same thing as a threat. Imagine you are absolutely certain that someone is going to criticize you, and then they criticize you. Your prediction was accurate, so prediction error may actually be low, but the situation is still threatening. Now imagine you expect criticism and instead they respond warmly. That may produce a large prediction error, but the unexpected event is positive, so it would be inaccurate to say that prediction error itself activates threat. Threat responding depends on what the brain infers about the probability, significance, cost, and consequences of what is happening. Prediction error is primarily information about a mismatch between prediction and outcome, and that mismatch can contribute to learning. Now, how do predictions actually change? Predictive processing is closely related to Bayesian inference, but you do not need to understand the mathematics to understand the basic idea. Your brain begins with prior beliefs about what is likely. It receives new evidence. The evidence is evaluated according to its reliability. The prior and the evidence are combined, and the resulting belief becomes the basis for future predictions. Prior belief plus new evidence leads to updated belief, and that updated belief becomes the future prediction. This process happens continuously. The important part is that updating depends on the relative strength and reliability of both the previous model and the new evidence. One contradictory experience may not be enough to overturn years of learning, and from an adaptive perspective, that makes sense. If you have seen the sun rise thousands of mornings in a row, and one morning somebody tells you the sun probably isn't coming up tomorrow, your brain should not immediately throw away the model. Stable models are useful. The problem emerges when a previously useful model remains highly influential after the environment has changed. And this may be one of the most clinically important implications of predictive processing. People often ask, if I know something isn't true anymore, why do I still react like it is? The answer is that knowing something consciously and revising a deeply learned predictive model are not necessarily the same process. Imagine growing up with a caregiver whose anger was unpredictable. Small changes in tone might have preceded conflict. Silence might have meant something was wrong. A particular facial expression might have reliably predicted criticism. Over hundreds or thousands of interactions, those patterns provided data, and your brain learned them. Years later, you may intellectually understand that your partner, friend, or therapist is not your caregiver, but similar interpersonal information may still increase the inferred probability of an old outcome. A quiet partner becomes something is wrong. A delayed response becomes I am being rejected. Someone asking for space becomes I am going to be abandoned. Someone expressing disappointment becomes, I have failed. These interpretations are not necessarily random irrationalities. They may reflect predictions generated from a model that once fit the available evidence extremely well. The problem is that yesterday's model is being used to interpret today's environment. Now, predictive processing offers a very different way of thinking about trauma. Popular trauma language has often suggested that traumatic experiences become physically stored somewhere in the body and later need to be released. But contemporary predictive accounts offer another possibility. The body unquestionably participates in trauma. Heart rate changes, breathing changes, muscle tension changes, hormonal and autonomic processes change. Interoceptive sensations can subsequently influence how situations are interpreted. But this does not require the body to function as an archive containing traumatic experiences. Instead, trauma related reactions can be understood as recurrent brain body loops involving prediction, perception, memory, attention, physiological regulation, action, and new sensory evidence. In a 2026 paper, Stephen Kotler, Michael Menino, Glenn Fox, and Carl Friston argued explicitly for understanding trauma through predictive coding rather than bodily storage. From this perspective, what persists is not a score physically embedded in tissue. What persists is a predictive architecture that continues to assign substantial probability to danger. The distinction is profound. Instead of asking, where is the trauma stored, we can ask, what is the system predicting? And what evidence would be necessary for that prediction to change? And I want to be clear, rejecting literal bodily storage does not mean pretending that trauma is all in your head. That would simply recreate the same mind-body split in the opposite direction. The brain and body continuously exchange information. Changes in heart rate, respiration, pain, temperature, gastrointestinal state, and other physiological processes provide interoceptive evidence that can influence ongoing inference. Consider anxiety. Your brain predicts possible danger and physiological mobilization occurs. Your heart begins beating harder, and now your brain receives information from the changed body. That information becomes additional evidence. Depending on context and prior learning, the increased heartbeat might be interpreted as I am excited, or I just exercised, or I drank too much coffee, or I am having a panic attack, or something is wrong. Same heartbeat, different inference. The body provides information, and the brain interprets its significance. One of the most powerful implications of predictive processing is that signals do not have universal meanings. A raised voice is not inherently dangerous. A soft voice is not inherently safe. Eye contact is not inherently reassuring. A racing heart is not inherently evidence of threat. Silence is not inherently rejection. Their significance depends partly on context, learning history, and expected consequences. This becomes particularly important in relationships. A particular facial expression may mean nothing to one person and carry enormous significance for another, because people do not enter relationships with identical predictive histories. Each person brings a model built through previous relational experience, and those models shape what the same cue means to each of them. And this is where predictive processing becomes especially relevant to attachment and relational trauma. Human beings are unusually dependent on relationships. We spend an exceptionally long developmental period relying on caregivers for protection, nourishment, regulation, and access to the social world. That means early relationships provide an extraordinary amount of information. Children repeatedly encounter questions like, what happens when I need someone? What happens when I cry? What happens when someone becomes angry? Does distress lead to comfort? Does closeness remain available? Does conflict lead to repair? Are other people predictable? Can I influence what happens? The child does not need to formulate these questions consciously. The patterns themselves provide information, and repeated relational experiences gradually make some outcomes more probable than others. Those learned models can then influence later relational inference. Psychology has long used the concept of schemas to describe organized structures that shape how people interpret themselves, other people, and the world. Predictive processing provides another way of thinking about this process. A relational schema may help organize predictions about what is likely to happen under particular interpersonal conditions. For example, if I depend on someone, they will eventually let me down. If someone sees my flaws, they will reject me. If somebody is upset, I need to fix it immediately. If someone pulls away, abandonment is coming. These conscious statements are not themselves the entire predictive mechanism. They are verbal representations of deeper learned relational models. The important question becomes not simply, what does this person believe, but what outcomes has this person's relational system learned to treat as probable? Here's an example that might land. Imagine two people receive the same message from their romantic partner. Can we talk tonight? Person A thinks, sure, I wonder what they want to discuss. Person B immediately thinks, they're leaving me. Person C thinks, oh God, what did I do wrong? Person D thinks, I don't want to deal with this. Same message, different inference. Those responses are not contained inside the words, can we talk tonight? They arise from the interaction between current evidence and existing models. This is why relational safety cannot be reduced to a universal catalog of supposedly safe cues. Human beings learn what interpersonal signals mean. Attachment strategies can also be understood within this framework. If closeness has repeatedly predicted comfort and responsiveness, proximity may remain an attractive strategy. If closeness has repeatedly predicted intrusion, criticism, rejection, or loss of autonomy, distancing may become more adaptive. If availability has been inconsistent, increasing proximity seeking may become useful. These patterns do not require us to assume that someone is consciously deciding, my attachment strategy today will be deactivation. Their behavior may instead represent an action policy shaped by learned expectations about what different interpersonal actions are likely to produce. And this brings us to active inference, which is about the fact that organisms do not just perceive, they act. Sometimes the system updates its beliefs to fit the world. Sometimes it acts on the world and changes what happens next. Suppose you are uncertain whether someone is upset with you. You could ask them, withdraw, send another message, seek reassurance, watch their facial expression, make a joke, apologize, become defensive, or end the conversation. Each behavior changes the information you encounter next. Your actions therefore help generate the evidence that your brain subsequently uses for inference. This creates a potentially powerful feedback loop. Imagine someone strongly predicts rejection. They notice ambiguity in a relationship and they withdraw before the other person can reject them. The other person experiences the withdrawal as disinterest and eventually stops reaching out. The original person observes, see, people always leave. The prediction helped shape the behavior. The behavior changed the environment. The changed environment produced new evidence, and the new evidence appeared to confirm the original prediction. This does not mean people simply manifest their trauma. It means perception and action are connected. We do not passively observe relationships, we participate in them. And that is one reason entrenched relational predictions can become remarkably persistent. So, how do we update these models? Not by simply telling ourselves that the old prediction is wrong. Information matters, but deeply learned models usually require evidence. If someone predicts, when I express a need, people become angry, then understanding the origin of that prediction can be useful. But the model begins receiving different evidence when the person repeatedly expresses needs and encounters responses that contradict the predicted outcome. The person predicts anger, and the other person remains engaged. The person predicts rejection, and the relationship survives disagreement. The person predicts that setting a boundary will destroy the connection, and the boundary is respected. The person predicts that conflict means abandonment, and conflict is followed by repair. Now the predictive system has something new to work with, not reassurance, data. And one safe interaction usually does not erase years of learning. That is not evidence that the brain is defective. It is evidence that stable models are difficult to change. A brain that rewrote its model of reality every time something unexpected happened would be useless. Updating depends on factors like how established the previous model is, how reliable the new evidence appears, how often contradictory evidence occurs, whether the new experience generalizes across contexts, how much confidence is assigned to the original prediction, and whether behavior allows contradictory evidence to actually be encountered. This is why repetition matters. A reliable relationship may gradually provide enough evidence for an old relational model to become less dominant. The brain learns. That prediction was once useful, but it is not always the best explanation anymore. I also want to address a common misunderstanding. If the brain interprets sensory information, that does not mean reality is imaginary. There is a real external world, and other people actually behave in ways that are caring, inconsistent, coercive, trustworthy, abusive, predictable, or dangerous. Predictive processing does not mean your perception created everything. It means the brain must infer the causes and significance of the information it receives from that world. Good inference depends on both sides of the equation, previous learning and current evidence. Sometimes prior beliefs distort interpretation. Sometimes the environment really is dangerous. Sometimes anxiety generates a false alarm. Sometimes the alarm is accurate. A scientifically useful framework must leave room for both. And I should also note that predictive processing is enormously influential, but it should not be presented as a completely settled description of brain function. There is substantial experimental evidence for prediction, prediction error processing, and experience-dependent updating across perceptual and learning systems. However, scientists continue to debate how broadly these explanations should be applied. That scientific debate is healthy. Predictive processing is powerful precisely because it generates mechanisms that can be tested, rather than functioning as a metaphor that explains everything after the fact. So, why does all of this matter? Predictive processing gives us a different lens through which to understand human experience. We are not simply reacting to what is happening. We are continuously interpreting what is happening through models built from what happened before. That helps explain why two people can interpret the same situation differently, why old relational experiences can influence new relationships, why ambiguous cues can trigger powerful reactions, why conscious knowledge does not always immediately change emotional responses, why avoidance can maintain old predictions, why corrective experiences can gradually alter expectations, why bodily sensations can amplify threat without literally storing trauma, and why relationships can become powerful sources of new evidence. Most importantly, predictive processing shifts the question. Instead of asking, why am I reacting like this when nothing is happening? We might ask, what does my brain think is happening? And then, what experiences taught it to make that prediction? And eventually, what evidence would allow it to learn something different? Your childhood does not need to be physically stored in your body for it to influence you decades later. The past can persist through learning, through memory, through expectations, through attention, through interpretation, through prediction, through the actions those predictions generate. A model built in one environment can continue operating in another. And because the brain is capable of updating, those models are not necessarily permanent. The past supplies the data. The brain builds the model. The present supplies new evidence, and under the right conditions, the model can change. That may be one of the most important things predictive processing can teach us about trauma, relationships, and healing. The goal is not to erase the past. It is to help the brain discover that the past is no longer the only available prediction. Thank you for listening to the Relational Safety Podcast. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. You can read the full written version of this episode with complete references on my blog at healingnarrativescounseling.com. I'm Stephanie Underwood. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.